Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first of two Monticello live streams in honor of Virginia Archaeology Month. I'm Fraser Neiman, Director of Archaeology here at Monticello, and I'm here with my archaeological colleagues, Derek Wheeler and Crystal O'Connor. Our goal today is to share with you some of our recent archaeological research here on the mountain. And we're going to do that in three lightning talks. So what's a lightning talk? Well, it's a bite-sized bit of research wrapped in a short, fast-paced presentation with pictures. So the idea is to present a research question, the methods that we use to address it, and at least our current results. So as usual with Monticello live streams, we encourage your questions. Please type them into the comments and we'll take them up at the end. I'm going to lead off by talking about some of our recent field work at Site 6, an early 19th century domestic site that was home to enslaved field laborers here at Monticello. Derek is then going to share some recent work on the evolution of the road system on Monticello Mountain. Roads were an essential component of both the agricultural and ornamental landscapes. And then finally, Crystal is going to offer some new insights into Jefferson's engagement with French cuisine and the discovery, our recent discovery of French-trained chef James Hemings' Sous Stove in the basement of the South Pavilion, Monticello's original kitchen. So let me start off with Site 6. A major goal of our research here at Monticello is to advance our understanding of the lives of all of Monticello's residents. What they were like, how they changed over time, and how those patterns of change fit into a larger story of the emergence of a slave society in the Chesapeake in the 17th and 18th centuries, and then its subsequent evolution. A key event in that larger story is a region-wide trend in the late 18th century towards agricultural diversification. This hits Monticello in the early 1790s when Jefferson switched the cash crop here from tobacco to wheat. He's really motivated by higher wheat prices in Europe caused by the French Revolution and then later sustained by the Napoleonic Wars. And the question we're trying to address is, how did this shift affect the daily lives of enslaved laborers? And our research at Site 6 helps us answer that question. So next slide, please. This is a shot of Monticello Mountain and our current coverage in the Monticello Plantation Archaeological Survey. Each of the colored dots is an archaeological site. The blue dots date to the tobacco period, and the red dots date to the wheat period. And you can see there's an important settlement pattern shift that occurs with the transition to wheat. And Site 6, the site that I'm going to be talking about, is marked out here. It's about a half a mile to the east of Jefferson's mansion on top of the mountain. Next. So how do we go about investigating a site like this? Well, as you can see, it's out in the woods. There's really nothing above ground to see. So what we do is excavate in 5-foot quadrats. These are randomly scattered all across the site so that we get pretty even coverage and therefore can make accurate maps of artifact distributions. The dirt comes out, goes through 1/4-inch mesh screens so that we ensure uniform recovery of artifacts. And then using those data, we can begin to make maps of how artifacts are distributed. And that's next. This is a map of our current coverage of those 5 by 5 foot quadrats. There are 166 of them out there. So a lot of work has gone into this. Next, and then using the data from these quadrats, next, we can make a distribution map. This is a distribution map of all the ceramics that we found on the site. The yellow areas are areas of high density. The blue areas are areas of lower density. And you can see that there are 3 major clusters, which I've labeled here: the North Household, the Southeast Household, and the Southwest Household. In addition, there's a third little minor thing peeking out of the bottom left there that is a cluster of artifacts around the water source at the site, which is a small spring. So each one of these three major clusters represents a house, and there's no above ground trace of it. These were simply log cabins. Their stratified remains are totally vanished. Next. We can assign each of our 5-foot quadrats to one of these three households, and using that density map that I just showed you earlier, and this gives you a sense of how that operation works. And once we've got those assignments made, we can begin to compare assemblage content, artifact assemblages generated by each of the three households. So next. A first question we might ask then of variation and trying to understand variation among assemblages is, are all these houses occupied at the same time? And to answer that question, you might think, well, we could map ceramic types. We know that pearlware is a type that is very popular in the early 19th century. Creamware tends to be popular a little bit earlier. So maybe if we map the percentage of pearlware versus creamware, we could sort of see what's later and what's earlier. Next. So here's the picture of what results from that. You can see on the left, the northern household has got lots more pearlware, followed by the, sort of as you go over to the right, followed by the southeast household and then the southwest household. So you might conclude from this that these aren't contemporary, that the northern household is later. But there's another hypothesis. Next. And that is that maybe there's more pearlware in the north because pearlware is more costly, and the members of that northern household may have sort of access to better resource access, and therefore are able to afford more stylish ceramics. Next. How might we evaluate that question? Well, we need some independent evidence, and we can get that by looking at the percentage of cut nails versus wrought nails. Cut nails are sort of come online in the early 19th century. Wrought nails really date to the 18th century. And if in fact the northern household really is later, we'd expect to see it have a lot more cut nails, but you can see it doesn't. In fact, the cut nail frequencies are pretty much the same across the board. And that suggests that actually this isn't a chronological difference among these houses. It's a social difference. It's a difference in resource access. There's inequality here. Next. So that's our current hypothesis, that really there's more pearlware because it's more costly. Next. So what might cause this inequality? Well, we know that a major avenue for enslaved people for access to cash was cultivating gardens and producing a surplus, which could then be sold to members of Jefferson's household or other free people in the area, folks with cash. And that then raises the question, well, how might we be able to tell if the folks in the northern household had gardens and therefore were able to avail themselves of this opportunity? Next. Well, our answer is that maybe by mapping the percentages of American stoneware among these households, that this might provide an answer. And here's the connection. If you have a garden, right, it means that you're producing your own food. And if you're producing your own food, you probably want to store it, right? You've got an independent household economy. So stoneware is going to be you'll need storage vessels. And so stoneware is going to be the key to telling us who has access to gardens and is able to produce enough food to store. Next. We can then look at the distribution of stoneware across these three households, and you can see this really remarkable pattern in which the northern household has the most, followed by the southeast households, by the southwest household. So this actually duplicates that pattern in pearlware that we saw. Next. So the next question then is, well, why might the northern household be able to have gardens, and maybe the other folks did not or couldn't have gardens as extensively? Well, one possibility is that if you think about it, in order to plant a garden, right, that means that you have to have some assurance of being around when the produce is ripe and you can harvest it. So maybe what's going on here is that the folks in the north have a reasonable expectation of being on this landscape, from season to season and year to year, and that makes investments like gardens, which require a long time before there's a payoff. It makes those kinds of investments worthwhile. How could we sort of think about identifying longer-term occupations? Well, archaeologists are big fans of how people clean up sites, and one of our major discoveries in the last few decades has been that when people occupy a space for a long period of time, they clean up. And the way we identify cleaning up, however, is a little bit tricky. We do it not by looking for where the most artifacts are found, but instead we look for a pattern of size sorting. So when people clean up a site, they move the big artifacts, the ones that get in the way, to the edges. And we end up with a configuration, well, like the one that's shown on these two maps here, where the densest artifacts are in the middle of the site where people actually live, but the large artifacts are in a kind of donut around that living area. And this is a pattern shown here that's initially identified among Aliawara foragers in the Western Australian desert, but it's found also among Maya villagers in Mexico and actually University of Arizona undergraduates as well. So this is a pan-human way of dealing with trash. Next. And so we can apply this, sort of look for this pattern at Site 6. Here we're looking at it by looking at nails. So again, on the left, you see the nail density map, wrought and cut nails mapped together. You see the three major households, the three clusters. But look at the size sorting map, the map of the proportion of large nails. We only see the size sorting donut in the north. There's no evidence of size sorting in the south. So that's pretty cool. And so let's go back then to our initial question. How did the transition to wheat affect the lives of enslaved agricultural laborers? Well, here's our current hypothesis. Work demands growing wheat were more complex than those for growing tobacco. Wheat, unlike tobacco, required permanent fields, crop rotations, fertilizer, plowing, carts, draft animals, pastures, fencing, mills. There are just a lot more jobs to do, and they were spatially dispersed. So large slave labor owners like Jefferson had an advantage here because they could move enslaved people around the landscape on short notice to meet these more complex work demands. We don't understand the process by which some enslaved people were able to negotiate a bit more stability for themselves and their families in some cases, but apparently at Site 6, members of the northern household were able to do that while members of the other two households weren't. So thanks. That's our coverage of Site 6, and I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Derek Wheeler to talk a little bit about roads at Monticello.
Hi everyone. As Fraser mentioned, my name is Derek Wheeler, and I'm research archaeologist here at Monticello. And one of the jobs that I like to do, can you forward it one more, please? Which is also a department goal, is to understand Monticello the plantation as opposed to Monticello the house. And one small aspect of that, as Fraser mentioned, was the road system. How did it change through Jefferson's lifetime? And how did it move from a working farm into what Jefferson designed as an ornamental farm here on the mountaintop? All right, if we go to the next slide. But first, let me back up just a touch and say, what is the Monticello plantation? At its height, around 1810, the Monticello plantation was 5,000 acres, and it was situated halfway or in between Charlottesville, the town of Charlottesville, and what is now just a small hamlet of Milton. It consisted of 4 main areas: Monticello Mountain, where Jefferson lived, which was called the home farm quarter, as well as 3 outlying quarters of Tufton, Shadwell, and Lego. However, today, in the next slide, we're just going to concentrate on the road system on Monticello Mountain, which you see here. All right, next slide, please. So what is the evidence for roads and the road system during Jefferson's lifetime? If we look at the next slide, the easiest method is simply walking the landscape, doing systematic survey, walking across the landscape, looking for road traces. and then using mapping equipment such as a GPS unit or a laser theodolite to map the location of these road traces. And that's what we see here in this particular slide. The solid pink lines are roads that can still be traveled on by cars or carts today, and the dashed lines are road traces that are within the woods and have trees growing through them. All right. Another method, which luckily on the next slide makes this first method somewhat obsolete, is using Lidar. And I can't really go into the technology behind it, but it allows for us to get very detailed topographic data. And this particular data comes from the US Department of Agriculture. And with that, we are able to make maps that show hillshade, and which shows the relief of the mountain. And here I have zoomed in on Monticello Mountain. You can see the mansion. And hopefully you can see on your screens all these dark lines running around the mountaintop, crisscrossing the mountaintop. I point to a few, but they show the road cuts into the hillsides, and it's reflected in this hillshade map. So that's a great opportunity. But in the next slide, we see the problem with going out and walking across the landscape or using this LiDAR data is like, what is the age of this road? How old is it? There's no way to tell. So this is where the last method is using Jefferson's maps that he made and overlaying them on top of a modern map in GIS software and tracing the road system that Jefferson portrays and matching them up with the road traces that we see on the landscape to get a better understanding of which ones were placed by Jefferson. So with that, in the next slide, if we combine those three methods with a little bit of research into dating when these particular maps were made by Jefferson, we can get an understanding of what the road system looked like in what we call the tobacco period. So sometime in the 1780s, maybe up to about 1790. In this particular map, we see a main east-west road. The roads are in kind of a purplish color in this map, called the Easter Farm Road, bisecting the agricultural fields, which are shaded orange in this map. And so obviously connecting the various interior parts of the plantation were vital, connecting the agricultural fields with the larger world. And if one continued on that farm road to the fort at Shadwell and off to Shadwell, which was Jefferson's birthplace, one could then get on roads that connected other areas of Virginia, such as Richmond or Williamsburg, or also continue on up to Washington, D.C. On the left side of the map, we see the Thoroughfare Road, which was a public road which connected Charlottesville and the town of Milton that I mentioned earlier. So, but other than that, the majority of the roads that we see here are centered around the Monticello mansion. And I picked out the North Spring, or shown on this map, the North Spring, because water was extremely important on the mountaintop. There were no springs on the mountaintop, so everybody who was living here, freed and enslaved, needed access to the closest, most reliable spring, which was the North Spring. So we see many roads built early on connecting the mountaintop to the spring source. However, we also see a few other roads, circular roads, going around the Monticello mansion, and these were the start of Jefferson's idea of organizing the ornamental farm, which is on the mountaintop. We see that these circular roads kind of are separate from the agricultural fields, and this was a design by Jefferson to remove the ornamental farm from the working farm. All right, if we go into the next slide. When Jefferson was minister to France in Europe, as minister to France, he took a side trip off to London for a short period and then traveled the countryside to visit English estates and their gardens. And he had a copy of a book, a recent book published in 1770, and that's describing these gardens, and he took copious notes in this volume. And he noted that he particularly liked English estates gardens that were designed by Capability Brown. Here we see an example of Bowood that was designed by Brown, and the particular aspect that Jefferson liked about it was a belt of trees, which you see shaded in green here, and then a widening path, carriage route, riding path, walking path, traversing it. And Jefferson really liked this idea and thought about transporting it here to Virginia where the climate was so hot, and having shaded avenues was a good idea to him. And then secondly, in the next slide, as Jefferson was traveling through Holland and the Rhine Valley, he noticed a mountain, a hillside, that had roads following the contours of the land, interspersed by these roads going up and down the hillside, connecting these roundabout roads. And he also, as you see in the slide, he notes that, hey, this is also a great idea for Monticello. So we see after a couple decades later, in the next slide, the evolution of the road system at Monticello. And this is probably what it looked like around 1810, so shortly after Jefferson returns from the presidency. And we still see this kind of division of the ornamental farm around the mountaintop, separated from the agricultural fields working part of the plantation, which the fields here are shaded green. And then you see that Jefferson implements this roundabout system, these roads that follow the contours of the mountain. He has 4 of them with a lot of connector roads going in between. And finally, he brings in the capability brown aspect of belted trees. And here Jefferson calls it the timber zone. And these are roads that are within, the belted trees. And so the 2nd through 4th roundabouts, as well as the connector roads, flow through this, providing the shade that Jefferson was looking for. All right, and finally, in the last slide, just looking at just short bit at the cost of building these roads. Jefferson notes in his own farm book that he builds over 12 miles of roads at Monticello, but almost half of that was these ornamental roads. They were not functional. They did not connect the plantation with the larger landscape or help with internal travel. These were purely for ornamental purposes. And this was Jefferson trying to situate himself in having a built landscape that showed that he was part of the elite world in the Atlantic world. And we see that the amount of time Jefferson had his enslaved workers to build these ornamental roads, they spent over a year just building these roads. And this doesn't include the cost of maintaining the roads once they're built, which required regular maintenance. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Crystal, who will talk a little bit more about the top of the mountain.
Thanks, Derek. And I'm going to round out the live stream today and talking about excavations in the South Pavilion kitchen, which is Monticello's first kitchen. So the question we're going to be thinking about for the last 10 minutes of the live stream is how recent excavations in Monticello's first kitchen help advance our understanding of Jefferson's engagement with French cuisine and how he and others used it to advance their own political and social interests. So you can see from this first slide, the first version of Monticello, you can see the South Pavilion circled in blue. Jefferson lived on the top story of the pavilion. Next slide. For about a decade before the first Monticello mansion was sort of completed. So he lived upstairs until about 1778 with his wife Martha and his daughters. The bottom of the pavilion served as Monticello's main kitchen for 40 years. So this is where food was prepared for Jefferson, his family, and guests. One thing that we found was the base of a stew stove. This stew stove is a key element in us tracing Jefferson's engagement with French cuisine and understanding better how he interacted with it. So in order to understand the stew stove, we kind of have to back up a little bit and zoom out from Monticello and understand the culinary scene in the world. Next slide. So the French tradition, the French cuisine, French food tradition really sort of is a evolution out of Renaissance cooking. So Renaissance cooking for the elite classes, so this is for a very small and particular segment of society, Renaissance cooking really focused on using costly exotic spices from Asia. So these were hard to get, they were expensive. These spices were sort of the main highlight of each dish. So the main highlight was not the meat or the vegetable necessarily, but the flavors were created from a blend of these spices. As more advances came along with military and shipping technology and the cost of these spices went down, wealthy people had to figure out other ways to assert their class as more people were able to get access to these spices. So one way that they did that, next slide, was by sort of inventing a new type of culinary tradition. So the French aristocrats were using a lot of fresh vegetables that had been brought over from the Mediterranean. This required the use of fancy kitchen gardens, gardeners who needed to know how to grow these vegetables, and chefs that would have needed to know how to prepare these items. Sauces sort of took over, light, delicate, creamy sauces took over those heavy spices. These sauces were created by using low heat. So eggs were a main ingredient for some of these sauces. Roux, ragouts, fricasses were very popular at this time to complement the flavors of the main ingredient. The way that French chefs were able to make these sauces and create them was by using low heat. And the piece of technology that allowed them to do that was a stew stove. So you can see early drawings of stew stoves here from the 16th century. Next slide. So a stew stove is the historic equivalent of a modern day cooktop. So you can see in this image a picture of, it's a recreation of a stew stove in Monticello's second kitchen. These are waist-high masonry countertops that have separate compartments, which were used as separate burners. Cooks would have placed saucepans or pots on top of an iron trivet, and they would have sat on top of a grate, and cooks put hot coals onto that grate. And this low heat would have helped evenly heat the liquid, the roux, in whatever dish was on top cooking. So chefs needed the proper equipment to do this, and they also needed access to a stew stove, and they needed the technique to prepare these dishes, and they needed to know French food. So this is where James and Peter Hemings' knowledge is really important at Monticello for sort of supporting Jefferson's belonging in the upper class and the elite classes. Next slide. So stew stoves kind of took off and start showing up in English pattern books in the mid-18th century. So Jefferson owned a book published by Robert Morris in 1755, and here I've circled two small drawings of stew stoves in kitchen spaces. So these are ideas that are being circulated among the elite classes. These things are fashionable, they're luxury items, and people who belong to the elite classes want these in their kitchens. Next slide. French recipes are also showing up in French cookbooks and eventually make their way into English cookbooks. Jefferson owned a copy of Hannah Glassey's The Art of Cookery, and which had French recipes and French sauces listed in them. Next slide. So Jefferson experimented, he did a lot of drawings, experimental drawings. The map that you see on the slide now shows a picture, a sketch of Monticello's first kitchen. So you can see in the bottom left that he drew a 5-burner stew stove. This is one of his earliest architectural drawings from 1769. So we had this going into our excavations, but you can never trust Jefferson's drawings. He drew so many, and not a lot of those drawings were ever implemented. So we weren't sure what we were going to find when we went into excavations. Next slide. But here we have the base of one of those stew stoves from Monticello's first kitchen. So we actually think that this is the second stew stove in this space, and a careful reading of the archaeological and the architectural traces lead us to that observation. There's two reasons why we think this is the second set of stew stoves. The first being that we know that this floor on which it sits, the brick floor, is a repair. So there's an earlier floor in this space. So the second thought is that you can see there's a drainage ditch that the stew stove is sitting on top of. This ditch would have directed water out of the door of the South Pavilion on the other wall. This ditch could not have been dug if that stew stove was sitting there, so there had to have been an earlier existing stew stove for this ditch to have been dug by workers. Next slide. So we think that the first stew stove Jefferson probably had constructed prior to his time he spent in France in the mid and late 1780s. Enslaved chefs, possibly as early as Souk, who's the first cook in this space, and then Ursula Granger, and then later James and Peter Hemings would have used these stew stoves. The second set of stew stoves, so the ones that are on the screen now, would have been probably constructed to James Hemings specifications following his return from France in 1789. So Jefferson took Hemings with him to France to be trained explicitly in the art of French cookery. And James would have been really an expert in cooking French cuisine. A visitor in 1824 described dining at Monticello as being served in half Virginian, half French style. So this is the space in which a lot of those dishes were created very early on. Next slide. Okay then, so to wrap up, to answer our question, the stew stoves are really the key architectural element in the trace of how Jefferson engaged with French cuisine. You would have needed, members of the elite class would have needed the stew stove. They would have needed vegetables, access to a fancy kitchen garden, access to equipment. So you see on the screen a picture of James Hemings' 1796 kitchen inventory. This is the inventory for Monticello's first kitchen. There's a lot of equipment in here, a lot of very specialized equipment. The first items listed are 19 copper stew pans, 19 covers for those pans, and that stew stove that we showed is the space on which these stew pans would have been used. So the stew stoves really help us understand Jefferson's involvement in and commitment to elite society. So next time you come to Monticello, be sure to swing by the South Pavilion, the first kitchen, and check these out because they're really cool.
All right, well, thank you all for sharing your knowledge with us. I have some questions, and I'm gonna go in the order that you all shared with us. So I'm gonna start with Fraser. First of all, we have a question from Bridget, and she would like to know if you have any more exact ways of dating a household other than relying on artifacts.
I think, yeah, the short answer to that is no. At least at sites like Site 6. Site 6 there's no real stratification at Site 6. It simply sits in a plowed field. So we can't, the only thing that sort of survives in situ, as it were, are the artifacts themselves. We do, when we excavate in other kinds of situations where we've got deep stratification, we can use other sort of more, physical science-based dating methods. A favorite is called optically stimulated luminescence dating, but for that to work, we need to have stratified sediments, and those sediments need to have been exposed to sunlight before they were buried, and they need to have been buried, and undisturbed, over the ensuing period. But yeah, ceramics are our friend. Although occasionally we find coins. So actually the great Site 6 is wonderful because we found a copper penny associated again with the northern household. And we couldn't read the date on it. It was so badly corroded, but we know from, just sort of its morphology that it dated to the 18-teens to 1820s. So nice corroboration there from our inferences based on ceramics.
Great. And then we have another question, which is how do living situations at Site 6 compare with the houses or cabins on Mulberry Row on the mountaintop?
That's a great question. One of the patterns that we see, the great thing about the archaeological record is that we can chart these patterns of change over time. One of the most significant patterns of change that we see in slave houses on Mulberry Row is a shift again in this sort of critical period in the 1790s from buildings with large rooms and multiple subfloor pits to buildings with smaller rooms and only a single subfloor pit or no subfloor pit. We think that represents a shift to family-based housing, and if you kind of think about that, that's probably represents an improvement in the living situation, that for enslaved people. So one of the things actually, if you just look at that pattern on Mulberry Row, you think, well, perhaps living situations for enslaved people are marginally improving during this period. I think the lesson from Site 6 is that that's only half the story. That they may be slightly improving for some enslaved people, but they are There are clearly other groups of enslaved people who aren't benefiting from these improvements, and the result is this widening pattern of inequality that we seem to see at Site 6.
Well, thank you for those answers. We're going to move on now to Derek. Derek, can you start by telling us, are there any plans to reconstruct the roads on the mountaintop here?
It's always a goal, and as I mentioned, a lot of these roads do exist currently. So very little maintenance needs to recreate them, whereas others are completely in the woods and would need a lot of work to recreate. But yes, at the moment, most visitors just visit the top or the mountaintop and perhaps walk down to the visitor center, and they might see 50 to 60 acres of the plantation. And if you remember, the plantation was 5,000 acres. So they're just seeing 1% of what was Jefferson's Monticello plantation. So we would love to have them be able to see more and experience more, but it's probably something for the future, and we don't have a set date when that will happen.
Great. And then you were talking a lot about ideas about gardens and where Jefferson got his inspirations. Can you talk a little bit about what the thoughts were at the time for using local plants versus imported plants for sort of aesthetic purposes?
Unfortunately, I'm not the expert on this particular question, although we should invite other people like Peggy to this talk. But I will say that Jefferson was one of his big goals, or one of the things he professed, was that if a new plant was brought into cultivation or introduced to the area, that was considered a successful thing. So Jefferson was constantly bringing in what we would call invasive species now, or non-native species, and planting them all over the mountain. He constantly experimented in his 1,000-foot long terrace garden with different plants to see what would grow here at Monticello.
And then one more, Derek, can you talk a little bit more about the timber zone and how do you determine what is evidence for its existence?
It's very interesting. Jefferson, yes, obviously the capability Brown plans show in the notes in the book that he used when he traveled and visited these gardens, notes that these belts, or what Capability Brown called belts of trees, struck Jefferson as important. However, he doesn't show on any of his maps this timber zone. On the back side of one map, he kind of describes it, and it's a very not the most coherent passage for someone who is not intimately related to the mountaintop, but he kind of describes it as a belt of trees, that the mountaintop was bare. You travel down the mountain, then you encounter this belt of trees that follows the contours of the mountain. And so it gets thinner or wider depending on how steep or flat the hillside is. However, next week, we will be having Dan Druckenbrod here talking about the timber zone. One aspect of his talk will be the timber zone, and he'll be looking at the physical evidence on the mountain from the trees themselves using dendrochronology, which is tree rings, measuring the width of tree rings, to help reconstruct the landscape, the physical landscape on Monticello, what was forested, what was cleared during Jefferson's lifetime.
Great, thanks, Derek. Crystal, a question for you. What are some other examples of stew stoves in the British Atlantic? And I know that a question that I often get as a guide is people sort of want to know, is this the standard cooking setup for people in Virginia at the time?
No, yeah, definitely not the standard. Having a stew stove meant you were a member of the elite class. You had access to resources and sort of the social knowledge that these things were fancy. So Mel, if you actually go to the next slide, there's a couple of other examples that we know of in the British colonies and in the Atlantic world. We know of two in Jamaica that are still, one of which is still surviving at Colbeck Castle. The owner was a very wealthy slave owner. in Jamaica. We have a couple other examples in the colonies. One of the earliest is from, I think, the 1750s from New Hampshire. The royal governor had one constructed in his house there. There's another one outside of Townsend, Maryland, at a place called Hampton. And then there's a third one at the Woodlands outside of Philadelphia. William Hamilton lived there. He was a friend of Jefferson's. They exchanged letters. So yeah, Sous Stove technology was very much only part of elite society at the time. And it's neat that Jefferson, has Sous Stoves here at Monticello. He had another set constructed at Poplar Forest, his retirement home. He had access to another set at the president's house in Washington. His contemporaries, Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, had Sous Stoves in various places where they lived. So definitely Sous Stoves were really for members of the elite class.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us today and talking about your work across the property here. Thank you all for tuning in today, and we hope that you will join us next week as well to hear about the work Derek mentioned dealing with dendrochronology.